So I actually read quite a lot of non-fiction books this year. Well, 12 to be precise. And here are my thoughts on each of them, as you may be interested in reading them yourself or to give them to your sciencey friends for Christmas. And I'll try and present them in the order that I read them. So I began the year with The Case Against Reality, How Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes by Donald Hoffman. This book wasn't what I expected, which is what I wrote on the inside cover of this book, which is somewhat fitting given this book is a lot about our perceptions versus reality and questions what reality is and isn't. And what I mean by that is Donald discusses in great depth about how we sense the world around us and our brain senses and processes different stimuli, and why you should take your perception seriously, but not literally. Now, shockingly, I haven't made deep notes from my highlights after reading this, despite the fact it was the first book of the year that I read, but I remember enjoying it at the time, at least the first half, and I would reread it if I didn't already have a massive lineup of books to read. So despite not fully documenting or remembering the details when I finished it, I gave it a 4 out of 5. So that's good. Alright, so next up is The Music of Life by Denis. In this book, Denis considers the system-level view of life as music, and uses the metaphor to ask the questions, where is the score, and who is the composer, if there is a program of life? I picked this book up from the library after a spontaneous trip while waiting for the bike shop to fix my flat tyre, and I'm glad I did. It was very easy to read, well written, thought-provoking, and I would highly recommend it. Anyway, the theme of this book is that there is no such program. The DNA sequence isn't the book of life. Sure, it's where the information is encoded, but life works also due to information not found in DNA. And it ultimately ends up discussing the different levels by which we can view life and introduces the readers to systems biology, and that there is no privileged level of causality in biological systems. And so, since I mentioned systems biology, later in the year I read a very short introduction to systems biology by Eberhard Voit. I made a separate video discussing what I thought were the most interesting concepts in this book, so I'll keep it short here. This small book is a good introduction to systems biology, essentially the use of computational tools and theory to analyse and simulate biological processes and see how chaotic behaviours can come from seemingly simple systems. Now, the second book I picked up on this spontaneous library trip was The Contact Paradox by Keith Cooper, which caught my eye because of the cover and also because I really quite like the film Contact. Anyway, I love this book and I felt very cool to be seen reading it in various places. Well, not that I really needed the book for that. But anyway, this book is indeed about searching for life out there or messaging life, so it introduces you to SETI and METI projects. And it also introduced me to concepts such as Dyson spheres. But it is also much more than that and discusses the altruism hypothesis, intelligence, and I'm kind of annoyed at myself for not making better notes in it before I returned it to the library, so I'll probably have to revisit again next year. Another book that I made a video on this year is How Spies Think, 10 Lessons in Intelligence by David Omand, which describes essentially what the book is about, how to think logically and make rational decisions. David was former director of the Government Communications Headquarters and applies knowledge from his time there to illustrate the 10 different lessons. I found this book quite dense and would have provided a more condensed summary. Plus, I don't feel like I have seen much of a difference in terms of my decision making since reading the book. But that said, I don't think it's trivial to apply some of the lessons that he tells you, but I do think it is quite an interesting book and you may thoroughly enjoy all the details. Maybe it just wasn't so much for me. Now, as you may have guessed, I've been trying to expand my horizons this year of my reading lists, and one book that helped me remember much of my physics A-level was Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality by Frank Wilczek. Another library book, so I can't actually physically show you it. It gave me similar vibes to The Contact Paradox, probably because they both talk a lot about space, but this was another book that I thoroughly enjoyed. Here Frank talks about space, time, atoms, quantum physics, and at the end human perception, which brought back memories of reading Donald Hoffman's book actually. Actually, I take that back. He ends with complementarity and what levels of description are sufficient or optimal to understand the system, be that how to fly a hot air balloon or understand the human body. It was fundamentally an interesting book. Now, one book I enjoyed reading this year was The Future of the Mind by Michio Kaku, the last of the library books, I think. I felt like I read this book around early summer, the same time I was rewatching all of Stranger Things ahead of the new series coming out. And why do I bring that up? Well, this book covers many topics about how our minds work, mind control, secret government experiments that were conducted, and obviously has references and connections to Stranger Things and the sort of powers that they possess. Anyway, I'm still currently making my deep notes in this book, and will have to say the references could be better, but still nonetheless very interesting, and maybe at some point I will make a video on this book. All right, so then I read The End of Everything, which sounds a little bit depressing, written by Katie Mack, a theoretical astrophysicist who studies dark matter, black holes, and early galaxy formation. So, as you may have guessed, this book is about the end of everything, and by that I mean everything, and discusses the different ways in which the universe can end. But to understand how the world could end, you have to understand how the world began, and it also has some nice figures to illustrate her different views. Now, I gave this book a bit of a lower mark, partly because I think I didn't learn as much, and that was probably my fault because I just read 2 space books previously. So yeah, but still a good book. Now, at some point during the summer, I decided to watch the film Radioactive, a film about the life of Marie Curie, which was interspersed with later life events such as Chernobyl and Hiroshima. And I suddenly had this mad panic that what if I had discovered something that later led to something really bad? And anyway, long story short, I came across this book, Biological Weapons, to see if I could learn anything that may help me in my sort of dilemma process. Frankly, I don't think it did, but it did give me a very in-depth historical perspective of what has already happened in terms of biological weapon testing in different countries and the consequences of that. Now, this book came out in 2005, so it's a little bit out of date now, and was actually written by the late Jeanne Guillemin, deceased wife of the famous biochemist Matthew Meselson, who was actually heavily involved in enforcing regulations on anthrax usage in the States. It's a very dense and detailed book, and personally I really struggled to read it at times, but again, I can imagine some people would really like this, definitely be their cup of tea. But yeah, I would really hope that someone makes some sort of like update book on biological weapons or biosecurity. That's definitely a book that I feel like is missing in the market. Anyway, after that, in one afternoon, I decided to read this little book called Cryobiology. Now, despite being a slow reader, I managed to read it in an afternoon because, well, it might be aimed at children. But sometimes, if you want a beginner's introduction to something, you have to take baby steps. And that's what I did. It's engaging, approachable, straight to the point, loads of pictures. It is quite outdated, to be fair, and I have already made a video on this topic the other week, so maybe you want to check that out. Otherwise, I don't think I would recommend buying it unless you have kids who would probably enjoy it. It was just more for my own personal entertainment, let's put it that way. Right, and so next I read this book called BioFuture, Confronting the Genetic Era by Burke Zimmerman. And I loved reading this book because the copy I ended up getting was a black hardback, and it kind of looked like I was reading Tom Riddle's diary, which is, but anyway, in all seriousness, it was a very interesting read. The book came out in 1984, and I feel lucky to sort of have a copy of this, which I got secondhand off Amazon. Anyway, it's part textbook, part popular science, and well, as Amazon describes, discusses human cell structure, genetic engineering, clones, the biotechnology industry, and the possible benefits and dangers of genetic experiments. Cool, right? And despite coming out almost 40 years ago, it's discussing topics that are still very relevant today. I can't say much more than that because I definitely need to go back over my notes in this one, so again, hold out for that. And also hold out because I literally just finished reading a book this week called The Biological Timebomb, which is in many ways very similar to BioFuture. Again, a very old book, this time written by Gordon Rattray Taylor, who actually did natural sciences at Cambridge, a long time before me though. And then he entered a career of scientific journalism. And this book actually came out in 1968, so even older. And to be fair, my own current impression is that this book was far less heavy on the science discoveries and more based on Rattray's assumptions that they will inevitably occur. And these include things such as longevity, organ transplants, IVF, mind control, genetic editing, and more. And then he considers the emotional, financial, moral, and social problems that come with it. Now, in both these books, The Biological Timebomb and BioFuture, they definitely had some sort of ideas and concepts that I don't think I 100% agreed with. But I don't think that's, sometimes is a good thing to hear other people's perspectives. But I haven't actually physically gone back through with a fine comb to sort of digest what I read in both these books yet. So I can't really say much more, but other than the fact that it was quite interesting to read these old books and has become a weird niche thing that I enjoy doing now. So yeah, that's that. So it turns out I read some interesting books this year, and it's been good fun revisiting them to make this video, and many of which I know I still have to revisit to make some more notes, probably while I procrastinate writing my thesis. Anyway, I hope that's given you some books to add to your reading list. Let me know what you read this year because, I don't really need any more books to add to my reading list, but maybe others do. And to be fair, I like to see other people's recommendations. So with that, I hope you have learned something in this video. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, and thank you for listening.